which takes us from the countryside of Bengal, India, to the streets of Houston, Texas. And it's really a beautiful journey told through a symphony of voices and spans several generations. We'll be talking about that more in a second. So I have some questions that I really want to ask her, and then I'm going to open it up to the rest of you. So if I don't ask what you wanted, you'll get your chance. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Laura. It's a real pleasure to be here and to share the stage with you. And I wanted to thank you, wonderful audience. I know all of you have been in like session after session after session, and I am so happy and appreciative that all of you are here. And I wanted to start off by telling you a little story about my life, which most people don't know about. So I thought that would be a fun way to start before we get into talking about the books. And Laura was saying that when I was going to college, I had to do a lot of jobs, odd jobs to make enough money to go to college. And one of them was I was going to school at Berkeley, and I was working in the International House, and I was working in the kitchen. And on bad days, I was sent to the dish room where I had to clean the dishes and put them in this huge, humongous, monstrous dish machine, which I was sure would eat my fingers one day. But on good days, I got to go to the desserts area where I was allowed to slice desserts. They'd come in these big pans, and I could slice dessert. And my absolute favorite thing was to slice the Jell-O dessert, okay? Now, I came from a very traditional Bengali family. I confess, never seen Jell-O until I came to America. So I was fascinated by the substance, solid yet not solid. And when people weren't watching, I would take these big trays of Jell-O and I would shake them, okay? Well, one day I shook the Jell-O too hard, and this huge crack appeared in the middle of this big pan of Jell-O. Well, that was the last day I was ever allowed to work in the desserts room. I was banished downstairs where I had to clean out vacuum cleaners for the rest of the semester. I thought you would like hearing that story. These are the things we writers do when we're not writing.
I love it. Well, perhaps those jobs gave you impulse for this first question I want to ask you, which is, I love your books for so many reasons, but one that speaks to my heart perhaps the most is not the plotting or the characterization. We were just talking, I heard you speak about this in the earlier panel, but more of a theme, and the theme of what I identify as giving voice to the voiceless. And I feel like that's one of my impulses as a writer, is to try to be a conduit for stories that aren't often told, or that our cultural gaze is not often directed at a particular person or group of people. And I feel like I learned so much about whether it's a poor girl in rural India or a poor Indian girl in Houston. But I just wanted to hear, is that important to you as a writer, or how does that play into your work of the idea of giving voice to the voiceless?
Well, I think that is an important idea, and it has been an important idea for a long time to me. And I'll tell you a story again about that. So even before I became a writer, I started doing volunteer work in the community with women in situations of domestic violence. And then later I went on to co-found organizations that help South Asian women. When I started, there weren't any in Northern California where I was living, and then I went on to found one, and now in Houston I'm connected with another one. But at that time, I would be working in the mainstream shelter and dealing with clients. And one day, the shelter called me. The office called me. The shelter is in a protected location. The office called me and said, "There's a South Asian woman here. Will you come and talk to her?" And there was indeed a young, very beautiful South Asian woman. And during the course, and she was very scared, and she had a little baby in a car seat with her. And during the course of my conversation with her, she lifted her shirt and showed me her back, and it was completely lacerated. And I couldn't even imagine how it could get into that state. And she was very scared, and she kept saying, I've made a mistake coming here to you guys. If my husband finds out, he's just going to be so angry. I don't even know what he'll do. So I've got to get home before he gets home so he won't know that I did this thing. And we kept talking to her saying, obviously your life is in danger. You should not go back to this person who is abusing you like this. And she went into all kinds of cultural reasons. Her family would not support her. She would shame the family if she left the marriage. And she was very afraid. She had a little boy there. What'll happen to my boy because I'm not trained to do anything? And we said, look, we can figure out all those things. We can figure out how you can survive in America. There are mechanisms. But the first thing is you can't go back there. But, we couldn't make that decision for her. So finally, at the all day, I remember I spent in the office just talking to her. The end of the day, she said, okay, I'll go into the shelter. And so a car came to take her to the shelter, which was in the safe location. And I gave her my phone number, and I said, if you have any questions or doubts during the weekend, this was a Friday, I said, call me. She took my number, but she didn't call me. She called her husband, and he came and got her. And we never knew what happened to her. And, I still think about her. I spent years of my life wondering, A, what happened to her, and B, what could I have said differently to make her not do that? And, I didn't have answers to those questions. But I always remembered two things she said to me as she got into the car that was taking her to the shelter. And I think they made me into a writer. And she said, who cares what happens to me? Who in this country really cares what happens to me? Who in this country even knows who I am? And I thought later, she's right. People can't care about what happens to her because they don't know her story. And I thought to myself, that's the kind of story I want to write. That's the kind of story I need to write. That'll make people know and hopefully make people care. And I think on some level, that's been at the heart of why I write.
And thank you for doing that, for giving the voice to the voiceless. I felt quite touched by that component of your work. Related, there's the topic of immigration, and recently I was in communication with Edwidge Dandekant, who's a Haitian writer, and she's coming to Fort Collins in November, and so I was asking her, one of my works is about immigration, but it's from people from Mexico, you're crossing the US border, illegally into the United States, and so we were talking about immigration issues, and I was asking her, do you think the experience matters from the originating country or area, or is the immigration experience very similar no matter where you're coming from? And I was curious what you would say about that and the immigrants that we see coming in through your work.
Well, I think the immigration story has several similarities, and it has several differences depending on the community and the circumstances of immigration. Some people have an easier experience immigrating, and for some people it's extremely difficult. They come out of different situations. They're immigrating for different reasons. Different kinds of things will happen to them after they immigrate. So all these things make each story unique. Given that, putting that aside, though, the immigration story is a huge part of the American experience. I would say most people in this room, they are either immigrants or their families at some point have been immigrants. So, it is a story that is deep in our DNA, I think. It's part of our American experience, even if it's removed for most of us. So I think, that's the paradox of the American experience. However, when I'm writing the immigrant story as best as I can tell it, which I always remind people, and people sometimes say to me, oh, I learned so much about India having read your stories, and I always say, oh, please remember that this is just one little sliver of the immigrant experience, of the Indian experience. I am just one voice, and you really need to read. You need to familiarize yourself with the wonderful plethora of voices that are there, because the Indian story is a very complicated story. and I would never presume to say that I am telling it. I'm just telling a little part of it. But the part that I'm telling, that comes from what I know, what I've learned, and I try to be as authentic to that experience as possible. And therefore, there will be many elements of that experience which are specific to that and not to others. So for example, in Before We Visit the Goddess, there's a grandmother, Sabitri, there's her daughter, Bela, and her daughter Tara. And Bela is going to come to America under unusual and illegal circumstances. Okay, I just said the word. Trump would just love this book. Okay, no, that was a joke. All right. So, but her husband, the man she's going to marry, she comes because she loves someone who's come to America. And he came to America because of political problems. If he stayed in Kolkata, he would have been killed. So he comes to America illegally, and that's one kind of immigration. In books like Arranged Marriage, I have other kinds of immigration, men and women who come here for economic reasons. So there's so many kinds of things. I try to write about several different ones.
And I liked what you said in the previous panel about specificity, in that it's each individual story that we can understand a new component of human experience. But thank you for that. I wanted to turn the next question from theme into more form, and I should say that this book is told. It's almost a novel in stories. I don't know if it's a novel in stories, and I'm curious if you had stories first and then the novel, or if you always envision the novel in stories. But I should say that it's mostly narrated between 3 generations of women. Sabitri, is that pronounced?
Sabitri.
Sabitri, Bela, and Tara, and you really pull off this idea that's been on my mind of late, because my next novel coming out is a novel told in stories, of how do you flip around between narrators, and yet you've got to connect your reader to a story and a central characters that we can really bond with. If we do too much flipping around, I think we start to lose the hold we have on our reader's heart. They want to follow someone and connect and see them grow and change. So I just wanted to hear about your process in all these narrators, and there's several narrators. There's male narrators and people speaking up kind of from various times and places.
Right. I think when I was writing Before We Visit the Goddess, I wanted to set myself a new challenge with each of my books. I try to do that. I want to set myself a challenge so I can learn as a writer myself as I'm creating this book. So here, that was the challenge. I wanted a 3-generational story because I wanted to trace the theme of heritage. I started thinking about this book soon after my own mother passed away. So the idea of heritage and of the immigrant family. My mother was in India and I was over here. And what could I pass on to my own children? All of those things were very important to me. But I didn't want, a 600, 700-page, 3-generational saga. That was not what I was interested in. So what I wanted to do was, I wanted to focus on the emotionally resonant moments. And I wanted to follow the path of memory. Because if you think about how we remember things, we don't remember them chronologically. We don't say, when I was 1 year old, this is what I did, and then this, and then this. We just have random memories that pop up in our heads, and yet they're not random. They're there because they were important to us. And that's kind of what I wanted to do here. And I was very aware of what you were saying. I didn't want people to lose sight of the 3 women. I wanted them to be there. I wanted their story to be told. They're telling their own stories. But in between, I also wanted some men to be telling stories, the men who are important in their lives for different reasons. Some of these men will just enter their lives and exit their lives pretty soon. So I wanted to balance the power and importance that family has, and yet how strangers can come into our lives and transform them too. So I was working with these 2 paradoxes in this book, and I hope the structure kind of embodies these different kinds of paradoxes.
Absolutely. I think it adds to this whole complex weaving, really, of so many stories, giving us one full, complete picture. It's just a beautiful choice, as opposed to a more traditional narrative. I'm just so glad you chose to leap around through consciousness and time.
Thank you. Thank you.
The novel is also very much about mother-daughter relationships, and I was wondering if, and maybe it's too personal a question, can you tell us about your relationship with your mother and your art? Was she supportive of your art, and how that informed your art?
Okay, well, I'll start with, I'll do it in the style of before we visit the goddess, non-chronologically. Well, my mother and me as a writer. So, you know, my mother was a teacher, and I also teach. Right? So I decided to become a writer fairly late. I'd finished all of my formal studies. I had already started teaching. And my mother was like totally on board with that. She was my daughter, the professor. She was like, she would tell all the people in the neighborhood. Then I'm like, Mom, I'm going to be writing. And she was like, yeah, that's a good hobby to have. I'm like, no, Mom, I'm going to be like writing, and publishing. And she was silent for a long time. And then, you know, so I started publishing, and I think she was very supportive of it, but we never, ever discussed any of our books, my books. Wow. And I think in retrospect, that was a good thing. That was a gift she gave me, perhaps unintentionally. But because if she had, you know, my mother is, even though she has passed away, very important in my life. I have great respect for her. She brought up myself and my two brothers as a single mom at a time when in India, in a traditional family, that was extremely difficult. And she went through a lot of hardship. And I know she didn't want me to go through that kind of hardship. So I think that was part of her worry about if I became a writer. But she never talked to me about my books, and I think that was a good thing, because if she had said, I don't like this, or you shouldn't be writing about this, on some subconscious level, I'm sure it would have affected me. So in fact, her silence gave me the freedom to write whatever I wanted. And, you know, I'm always appreciative. The last book that she read of mine before she passed away was Oleander Girl. You know, she was getting old, so I asked her, Mom, what do you think of the book? And that was like the first time, and I was kind of afraid, like, what she would say. And she said, which in traditional Bengali means, that's pretty good. And we let it go at that.
That's a beautiful way of experiencing that choice to not communicate. While you're speaking, I just wanted to know a little more about your childhood. Would you mind speaking for a little bit about that and your early experiences?
Well, I grew up in India in a very traditional Bengali family. I grew up all over India, although we are originally from Kolkata, and many of my characters are from that area. My father moved around a lot. He had different jobs, so, you know, the family moved around a lot with him. I think parts of my childhood experience that were very happy moments for me was when I spent them with my grandfather. And this morning I did a session called Stories My Grandmother Told Me. Well, I had a grandfather who told me wonderful stories out of our folk tales, some of which I'm now writing down in book form for children. So that was a big part of my experience. And I think that got me very interested in folk tale, fairy tale, and epic. And as some of you know, I went on to write the Palace of Illusions, which is a retelling of the Mahabharata from Draupadi's point of view.
Okay. Fabulous.
And the rest of my childhood and, in fact, life, let me just tell you what my two boys, who, when they were teenagers, they said this. They said, Mom, it's a good idea. It's a good thing that most of your books are not autobiographical. And I'm like, why is that? And they're like, that's because your life is kind of boring.
I heard it once said that authors actually should have some boring lives so that they have the time to sit in their chairs and write the books about people who don't have boring lives.
Exactly.
I don't know if that's always true, but... Well, speaking of, it's related. I just love the way you were so honest and real and raw and true about women's relationships to their bodies and sexuality and mothers and I just felt like you were really giving it an honest gaze. And we're going to let her read in a little bit, but I just wanted to read 3 lines or 3 or 4 lines that really struck me about this and that kind of speak to taking on the somewhat touchy subject of women's roles and changing them and kind of examining them and for example, that women should love motherhood, for example. So here's from the middle of your book. 3 years of married life, but even now when she heard Sanjay's key rattling in their apartment door, a shiver of pleasure went through Bella, no matter how tired she was. Usually that was very tired because of the long hours she put in at the tiny treasure's childcare. She hated the job, the endless diaper changing and vomit cleaning, the colicky babies that screamed like banshees as soon as you put them in their cribs. But it was the only place that would hire a woman like herself, untrained, inexperienced, at the bottom of the food chain. Then came the household chores, cart the groceries back from Lucy's 3 blocks away, lug the laundry down to the washing machine on the ground floor, lug it up again, sweep and mop the pocked linoleum floor that refused to look clean no matter what she did. And finally the cooking, which always took too much time because Bella was a perfectionist like her mother, though she hated to admit it. She disdained American food and took pride in preparing, from scratch, spicy fish curry or potatoes seasoned with panch phoron and whole red chilies. And I just love that look at what she hates about, traditional female roles. And I was wondering I just love that you take that on, and then was that purposeful? And did you like doing laundry? And who likes doing laundry?
Yes, and as my, what shall I say, as my family will tell you that I'm not that great in the kitchen either. So unlike at least 2 of these women, the grandmother and the mother, who are wonderful cooks, I'm really like Tara, the granddaughter. My aim in life is from cutting board to dining table in 20 minutes flat. That's Tara as well. Well, each of these women are very different. I wanted to make them their own selves. I wasn't thinking so much about, breaking boundaries or breaking roles. I just wanted these women to be who they are, and they are who they are because of things that have happened to them, situations in which they find themselves. But you were talking about their sexual roles. I have to share another story with you, which is that this book came out this year in India, and it's doing very well, for which I'm very thankful. It was #1 on the national bestseller list for a long time, and so I got a lot of media interviews, all right, so from India. And so one of the interviewers is like, "There's a lot of sex in this book." I'm like, "Yeah? Much of it is between unmarried people." I'm like, "Yes, that's true. Why is that?"
Why is that?
Why is that? I'm like, maybe because it happens in real life. But before you get too excited, I want you all to buy this book, but not under false pretenses. I should tell you what my husband says with great disappointment when he reads. He says, "Indeed, there's a lot of sex in your books, but they're all in the white space between sections."
That's funny. Thank you. All right, on to a completely different subject, which is what I wondered how you enjoyed or didn't enjoy living in Texas. How is Texas? Place is very important in your books.
Yes. Texas. I love Texas, but it took me some time to get there. When I first moved from San Francisco to Texas, I said to my husband, well, we won't repeat what I said to my husband, because it was his job that took us there. But over the years, I have just come to love Houston and many things about Texas which people don't think about when they think about Texas. First of all, Houston is a wonderful, cosmopolitan, and warm city to live in. It is very good to its writers and to its artists in general. I'm blessed to teach in one of the top writing programs, creative writing programs in the country. So I feel that I'm around writers a lot, and I just love that. One of the reasons I wanted to place a number of these stories in Texas is to break some of those stereotypes about Texas. So this is a very multicultural Texas that you're going to find in this book. There are people of many nationalities, many sexual preferences, just many different cultures. And I wanted that to be the Texas that was in this book, because that is a very real part of Texas. And I've learned a lot about writing, living there, watching people, and now putting them in my books.
Yeah, that was exciting for me to end up there in Houston, of all places.
Thank you.
Well, I have one more question, and then would love to have you read. It has to do with the power of communication, and also I think about how difficult it is for human beings to communicate with one another, even when we're very well-intentioned and smart and trying and we're making an effort. It's very hard sometimes for humans to share their innermost selves. And at the end of the book, I cried along with your main character, because the book starts, I'm going to say, with the grandmother writing a letter to her granddaughter, trying to tell her about her life, and those letters become important. I don't want to give away the plot, but those letters are found later. And I'm always struck by that. As writers, we're both trying to communicate the real stuff, and yet we also seem to be hyper-aware of the limitations, that there was a communication gap between all three of the women, really, and that they didn't fully see each other, I thought.
Yes, I think before we visit the goddess, I wanted to point to that paradox of human relationship, which is sometimes the people we love most are the people we have most difficulty communicating with, just because there's so much expectation, there's so many emotions, there's so much background baggage, there's so much history. And so sometimes it is that, in this book also, it is that strangers can come and help us, where our family has failed to do that. So I wanted to point out that paradox. And yet, these women are incredibly important to each other. Even when they're not communicating, they are thinking about each other. They're wrenched to their souls thinking about each other.
Yeah, but they can't always get the words out. You would think it would be easier as humans to communicate, but it's not.
It's not. That's one of the paradoxes of human experience, right? We tell things to strangers or to acquaintances that we really can't tell to people who are very close to us.
That's true. Well, I was wondering if you would take a moment to read a passage.
Sure, and I'll read a short passage, and I'm going to ask the audience, it can be the audience's choice, do you want a dramatic passage, which is kind of painful, or do you want a funny passage, which is perhaps not as painful? Okay, so dramatic passage, hands. All right? And funny passage, hands.
Oh,
okay, more for hands. It is the end of the day. I think we will read the funny passage. There is some sex in this passage. All right, so this is about Tara. And the book is, her stories are told in first person, so this is her voice. And at this point in the book, Tara has been having a hard time. Her parents have split up. She's taking that very hard. And she dropped out of college. Now she's working in a thrift store. And she has recently moved in with a massage therapist, Robert. And, maybe she entered into that relationship a bit rapidly, because now they're having some problems. They're having some fights, and she's going to explain why. The reason for my fight with Robert is a stuffed raccoon. Some of you who were in my previous session heard about this stuffed raccoon. I want to confess, full confession, I never intended for a stuffed raccoon to be in this book. It appeared and refused to leave. Okay. The reason for my fight with Robert is a stuffed raccoon. He won it from Victor, his best buddy, the result of a pool-playing bet involving something called a bank shot with throw, the intricacies of which I failed to grasp, and installed it on our chest of drawers 2 weeks ago. Apparently, the raccoon is valuable. More important, Victor had shot and stuffed it himself, and he was terribly cut up at having to part with it. He offered to buy it back from Robert for $200. And you refused? I eyed the creature with disbelief. Its upper lip was lifted in a snarl, and one front leg was shorter than the other, though that could have been the result of Victor's taxidermy. It appeared ready to spring off the chest of drawers and launch itself upon us. But naturally, said the love of my life, you should have seen Victor's face. He ran his hand over the raccoon's back. Feel the fur. It's incredible, soft and bristly at the same time. I declined. The only thing I found incredible was that he expected me to sleep in the same room with this monstrosity. Want a shower? Robert offered as a peace gift. I considered sulking, but I love showering with Robert, his fingers unbuttoning my clothes, letting them drop where they will, the way he holds me as he soaps my back, as though I were a child who might slip and fall. White space. But afterward, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the sliver of moonlight that had edged through our window, illuminating our belongings, secondhand waterbed, 2 gooseneck lamps that didn't match, chest of drawers, a teetering stack of books. Coming from my parents' overcrowded home, I'd felt proud of our minimalism, but tonight it frightened me how either one of us could walk out the door and not feel we'd left anything behind that we cared for. Except now, the raccoon. I became aware of a musky odor. The raccoon? Surely it couldn't smell, except of whatever embalmment Victor had used. Was it the scent of another woman? I couldn't stop myself from imagining Robert at work, his hands caressing female curves. What did he say to them? What made him the most popular massage therapist at Body Work? The raccoon's eyes glinted. Its tiny teeth shone, so white they could have been in a toothpaste ad. I pushed myself closer to Robert and held him tightly until he gave a drowsy grunt and twitched away. In the morning, I asked Robert to move the raccoon to the living room. He refused. I claimed he was inconsiderate. He accused me of not caring about what was important to him. I took to covering the raccoon with a pillowcase when Robert was out of the house. He took to checking on it first thing when he returned. Without a word, he'd ball up the pillowcase and throw it with vicious accuracy into our dirty laundry basket. I'd rescue it surreptitiously so I could use it again. It was like a vaudeville show, except not funny. Thank you.
Are there questions from the audience?
Is there a mic in the audience?
We're going to do a mic so people in the back can hear as well.
It's obviously a very nice book. I'm curious about how you choose the names of your characters, because Savitri Bela, Tara, all three represent some kind of personality to me. I mean, Savitri is obviously traditional Indian woman, and Sati Savitri and all that. And Bela is a little more contemporary. Tara is more anglicized. So are you conveying something about the characters by their names?
Yes, definitely. I choose those names very carefully. And there are also like mythical ironies in their name, because Shabitri is named after an mythological character who is able to bring her husband back from the dead, but this Shabitri is not able to do that, in fact has to live on without him and, you know, deal with the downside of that. And yes, Bela is a more contemporary Bengali name, and then Tara is exactly that, chosen so that it could be a name that straddles two cultures. But what happens is that Tara is also one of the names of the goddess, and that resonates with the title of the book, Before We Visit the Goddess, and the meaning of the title, which occurs on several levels. The literal meaning occurs when Tara goes to visit she goes to visit the biggest Indian temple in Houston, which is a temple of the goddess Meenakshi. And she goes there kicking and screaming against her will. It's just a job she has to do, but when she goes there, some amazing things happen to her.